Catherine Merridale's book Ivan's War tries to dig into letters, diaries, memoirs, and other sources to try and describe the experience of the regular army soldier, the so-called Ivan. When David Glantz and Titans Clashed or Alexander Hill in his study of the Red Army often talk about things like morale problems, logistics and supply issues, or inadequate training and leadership, Catherine Merridale takes it a different way, and she paints those things with a very human face. In this review, I'm going to go over what I think the merits of the book are, as well as parts where I think it could have done more or needs to be used alongside other sources. While not perfect, this book is one of my favorites, and it's a must-have for anyone that wants to understand the human side of the Soviet perspective in World War II, especially for Western readers. Part 1. The Visceral Red Army. During the Winter War, Soviet soldiers in Finland were unprepared for the battlefields that their own weapons would create. Without a basic understanding of their role, soldiers found battle incomprehensible and terrifying. An infantryman in the 7th Army caused havoc one morning when he shrieked so loudly that his whole battalion took fright. He explained later that he had glimpsed his own face in a mirror and taken it for Finnish snipers. His scream disturbed the nearby signals unit, whose men started firing wildly, without orders, wasting precious bullets in the air. Stories like this one are really where Merridale's work shines brightest. While it is correct to say that Soviet soldiers weren't trained properly during the Winter War with Finland, these sorts of accounts in this book add a human element as well as evidence for the point she's making. This book is at its best when it lets the stories of the men and women of the USSR do most of the talking. She describes things like the poor conditions of the barracks and army life of the Red Army leading up to the war, with men writing how they would neglect their duty during the day to try and get jobs to afford more food. They thought it was so bad. We get to see some pretty candid opinions that became more available after the partial opening of the Russian archives with the fall of the USSR. Things like Germans being welcomed during Operation Barbarossa by the non-Russian ethnicities, or even Russians who were upset about collectivization of farms. While historians from Alan Clark to Max Hastings have long made arguments about how the Germans squandered their status as liberators in the eyes of many in the USSR by committing war crimes and genocide, Merridale lets the citizens speak for themselves, and it adds that extra element to these other arguments made by different historians. We never saw an officer. The generals ran away. They changed their trousers and left us to fight. The way Merridale writes, even when talking about the atrocities committed by the Red Army or the problems with the USSR, it's usually very respectful and empathetic to the regular men and women of the USSR and Red Army, while still being critical of the Soviet system as a whole. She spends a lot of time talking about life in the USSR and how that shaped the social, political, and economic experiences and views of its citizens. She doesn't paint them all as evil Reds, but rather as victims of a system that was built on dehumanization and collectivization using a lot of propaganda, who had fought in a war for their very survival. This even includes dealing with controversies such as how the Red Army treated women of Prussia as they invaded in and moved towards Berlin. Instead of just focusing on sexual frustration or evil, she actually tries to explain it using a variety of sociological and psychological factors and the propaganda that tried to get the soldiers to dehumanize the Germans, or the frustrations with seeing the apparent wealth of the Junkers and non-collectivized farmers in East Prussia, and how that was unfavorably compared to their own experiences in the USSR. She's also very candid about the role of alcohol abuse and commodification of women in these atrocities, so don't think that her being empathetic to Red Army soldiers and her balance is just apologia for this sort of behavior. It acknowledges atrocities, but also tries to critically analyze them. She also tries to provide a general narrative from before the war to the war itself to life for veterans after the war. From the triumphant films watched by young Soviet men and women, which very inaccurately hoped that the war would not be fought on Soviet soil, to problems with any man who was labeled a traitor that made it impossible for their widows and families to receive any insurance or pension after the war. I would note here that, in my opinion, this work does require some background knowledge. She has a very high level of detail, and if people aren't completely familiar with campaigns like the Winter War in Finland, Operation Barbarossa, Case Blue, Bagration, etc., she explains the general concepts the best she can and the ebbs and flows of the conflict while trying not to lose focus. But the more you know going into it, the better off you will be. Part 2, Finding Private Ivan. On an academic level, while I do recommend this book, its central thesis is basically impossible. Merridale wants to find Private Ivan in his experience, but the sources available make this a daunting task. While she does feature stories from peasants and tries to discuss non-ethnic Russian minorities, the fact is that letters, diaries, memoirs, and combat reports are going to come from the more educated and literate people who had the time and luxury to write them. While Soviet literacy was nearly 90% for men at the start of the war, it's important to note that she can only use the sources she has. While she is critical of communism, a lot of her sources are going to be officers and commissars who are having moments of doubts, and it's not always the salt of the earth regular peasants that readers might want or even Merridale might have wanted to get more of. This isn't her fault. She has more than 200 veteran interviews, but I just want to make you aware of how hard it is to find the experience of a common soldier if the common soldier was so diverse in ethnicity, background, generation. And it's even more challenging with men and women being brought up in propaganda and living in a censorship state. The fact is that the nature of the USSR does color any memoir, any writing, any source that comes out of it, and may have affected the history that we got. She gives so many voices to so many people and provides an incredible variety of perspectives and experiences, but this by nature makes it hard to find Ivan. I don't think this devalues her work. I think she does craft and support some common experiences, and I think the accounts that she presents are illuminating for what life was like in the USSR. But the truth of the matter is, it is hard to do a microhistory and a bottom-up history within the USSR, so on an academic level, just be aware of that. Merridale doesn't shy away from this, and her discussion of PTSD and treatment of veterans is an example of her methodology. She explains that while it's a safe assumption that the men of the Red Army, like men in all armies, suffered from PTSD, censorship and the use of euphemisms in government and medical documents make it hard for historians to find and explore evidence of such events. Where evidence doesn't exist, she will conjecture using what she can, like talking about the veterans returning home and what they may have felt, but without new sources coming to light, I think she's doing the best she can with what she has, and she's providing a very valuable contribution to the historiography of the Eastern Front. She is trying to dig deeper into the mindset of the common people, and with what she has, I think she does a very good job. Some readers might object to her criticism of communism, similar to how Antony Beevor can rub people the wrong way. But I think she shows enough empathy for the common men and women of the USSR to make this work worth it, even for the tankiest of tankies. And if you're not super red, you should probably find nothing objectionable in it. Part 3, Overall Conclusions. While it might be impossible to find a single universal Private Ivan, Catherine Merridale brings a variety of accounts to the table with Ivan's War. The book is brutal and visceral and shows the privations and sufferings of the citizens of the USSR and Red Army without getting tropes about the Red Army having won due to being an Asiatic horde motivated by commissars, guns at the backs of their heads. You know what you get from any German source or Enemy at the Gates. She is digging deeper, and she is using experiences from actual Soviet citizens to share their own stories. While she covers things like Order 227 and the brutality of the USSR, she often lets the men and women speak for themselves and explain why they fought, what that was like for them, and what their actual experiences were. Many of the videos on my channel cite it heavily when I'm trying to explain what Soviet soldiers went through. And if I make a trope or claim like their training was bad, this is a great source to go to actually dive deeper. It provides a human element to analyses of why the Red Army performed so poorly early on in the Second World War, or why it took such high casualties. With partial opening of the archive accounts, this book provides Western readers with a glimpse, however small, into the minds and hearts of the people of the Soviet Union. Even if you don't agree with her thesis, or you don't like her criticism of the USSR, I wholeheartedly recommend this work, just for the accessibility and compelling nature of the stories and accounts she brings. Even if you don't like her analyses, this is a wonderful primary source account delivery system. The accounts are often heart-wrenching or tragic, but they are endlessly fascinating or illuminating. Read this along with Glance to just see how demoralizing lack of training, leadership, or supplies can be and what that translates to for actual human experiences. Thank you all for watching. If you want to get a hold of this book, I have a link in the description. It is an affiliate link, which means you get to check out this book, and I do get a little bit of money to help me keep making content, so just be aware of that. As always, stay excited about history.